was it 4 years ago we started talking to each other?
Oh, 4 or 5 years ago, I would have to say. Yeah.
And that's when you were first doing the Australian Cryptozoology Conference, or was it shortly after that?
It was about the time, yeah. So I started the conference in about 2016.
Uh-huh.
And, yeah, so I was around that time. It was when it really started to get bigger as well.
Yeah.
And I think, yeah, by 2018, we were getting messages, emails from speakers around the world wanting to come and speak, and also in Australia as well. So the reputation grew as well for the conferences because we don't.
I just remember happening upon it. I don't know how we got in touch, but I saw that Gary Uppert was there, and I'd followed Gary for a while, and Rex Gilroy, all those guys, and I'd had this long-term interest in the Yowie and all the different creatures there in Australia, and we started talking, and I just thought, wow, this is a place. It's a place to visit, and as a British person, of course, we've got that strange connection,
Yes, exactly.
We share a monarch, and exactly. There's this sort of line of sight, even more so than Americans in a way. I think there's just a bit more understanding, sort of like a more direct line of understanding, culturally speaking.
It's really interesting because I have spoken to Americans before that think I'm British, and there's a lot of people that think they just know I'm Australian as well. So I think that the way we speak as well can be similar. I speak to people from Melbourne and Adelaide who have a rather British accent as well, but they're from Adelaide, they're not from England. So it's really interesting. The dialects similarities as well.
Yeah.
Some South Africa sound like New Zealand, or stuff like that as well. But I think culturally we're different and the same. We're different and the same at the same time.
Yeah.
So it's really how close UK and Australia are. Even when it comes down to our comedy, which is a big thing to do with culture, I reckon. British comedy is completely different to Australian comedy. Both can be extremely crude, but that's just that similarity as well, because UK is also known for their comedy. I also known for our comedy, so but just very different as well. And even I've watched many British TV shows over the years, so culture-wise, I can see a lot of similarities, but also differences as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's I always because we always moan about the weather here and everything. Everybody moans about the weather. If it's hot, it's too hot. We don't have aircon. If it's cold, it's too cold. Nothing works. And and people wonder about what British people would be like in better weather. I always say, well, we know what they would be like. They'd be Australians. They are essentially us with good weather and great food. This is what we're looking at. We already tried that experiment, and it's working out fine for them. And and the other joke, of course, is they sent the prisoners there, but we had to stay. There's some sort of, something's not right here. So anyway, all those silly jokes aside, the one thing, and I know I'm coming next year to visit you guys to do the Australian Cryptozoology Conference, which I'm really excited about. But it got me thinking about all the different types of Aussie cryptids. And it's a massive expanse of land. There's such a small population for such a big place. That's not really, that interior is empty, isn't it? I just wondered if we could go through like a few of the cryptid creatures and just, find out your ideas and those. And I love water monsters. So I thought maybe we could start with something like the Bunyip, for instance. What do you know about that?
Well, the Bunyip's actually a really interesting one because we're known for the Bunyip here, and outside of cryptozoology, it's a big part of our folklore. It's a big part of who we are as well. There's tales from where I come from, Newcastle, which is 2 hours north of Sydney. One of the first things was the second city in Australia, and there's a place here called Hexham, and it was the Hexham monster or the Hexham Bunyip, which is one of the if you look up bunyip stories online, you'll be able to come across the Hexham bunyip, and because the Hexham swamp, which growing up I would go past all the time, had no clue that there was tails of bunyips there, and there hasn't actually been any reported sightings of bunyips since about the 70s. So, which is very interesting. I've heard many different ideas, and I've spoken to Gary about it. He has his ideas about possibly seals or sea lions coming in, but the area where these bunyips have been sighted are in areas where they're cut off from the sea. We're talking in the outback, where there's a place called Walgett, which is northwest New South Wales. So it's in the outback, quite far from the sea. There's a place there, and I first heard about this from a lady who I'm close to, practically family of mine. She's Indigenous, and her family's Indigenous, and they come from the Walgett Lightning Ridge area. They're from the Gamilaroi tribe. I hope I pronounced that right. But basically, there's a place there called the Two Meeting Rivers, and in the Two Meeting Rivers, supposedly growing up, she'd hear stories of the water dog, which was also another name for the bunyip, and she couldn't go near there. So the bunyip is described kind of like a giant seal, but it varies as well. It's hard to gain an understanding. Like if you look at illustrations depicted by artists of what their vision of a bunyip is, always completely different. They look completely different. They seem to be like they've got flippers and stuff like that, like a seal body, right? But the face seems to be quite different. So it's interesting how close to a seal that they're just, described, but yet in areas where seals should not be, or where they can't get access to. So the bunyip is one of the most fascinating, in my opinion, just due to the amount of sightings for the many years before colonisation and many years after colonisation as well, up until the 70s. That makes it even more interesting, because these are areas where there should not be any seals, and yet these seal-like animals that have been described in the waterways or in the billabongs of the outback. So that was very interesting.
Have there been? Do you know if there have been any barrages or dams erected between sea inlets and those areas in that time, since the 70s, that could perhaps have stopped the seals coming in?
I don't think so. There are, if you look on a map. So Walgett, we're talking Walgett's miles and miles away. Like it's in the thick outback.
Oh, we're talking hundreds of miles in, basically.
Yeah. So you've probably seen New South Wales on the map, right? Well, Walgett is going towards the corner, or the northwest corner. So that's pretty far from the coastline. You have to drive for miles. You have to drive for ages just to get there. For me, I think it's going to take about 10. So I live on the coast, so it's going to take about, I think once I actually looked, because I was looking at going to Walgett one time, 10.5 hours drive from here.
Wow.
So it is quite. So that in itself, just how far it is completely interesting. And from a zoological perspective as well, you start to ponder like how the seal-like creatures that are being described in a place like Walgett, so far in the outback, so far from the coast. You know how big Australia is, and how much desert and how much of it is coastline. That's pretty huge. There's a pretty huge difference, distance from, where the coastline is.
I remember a moment ago you mentioned that the head is the body is like a seal, like a sea lion, but the head is different. What's different about the head?
Well, most descriptions have it as like a dog. So it's really interesting because, as I said, the illustrations differ. The illustration I looked at, that the body was like a seal, but the head was like a rabbit. So I guess different artists have different illustrations of the bunyip. There's different tales of it. So to get a visual of the bunyip is quite difficult. So the bunyip for me has always been one of the most intriguing because of the lack of information, although a lot of information, but then a lack of information as well. So that has become quite fascinating.
You know, I for a long time I wondered because of that seal-like representation if there was a correlation between the Australian bunyip and the Doarcoo of Ireland, which is also sort of like a giant seal, if a way, or more like a giant otter actually, but it has those similar qualities. And I think they normally refer to it as a giant otter, but for me, this crossover, you know, it's quite significant. There were two chaps, Gary Cunningham, I forget the other chap's name, and they've written some great books on sea monsters in the lakes of Ireland, called the seal, and one of them is called the seal serpent theory, basically about ancient Irish seeing these perhaps errant sea lions coming across the Atlantic and swing about up into the small locks through the rivers in their part of the world and being spied, by, I suppose, locals who have no clue what they're looking at, or at least don't expect to see a creature like that in that environment. And then these legends grow up out of it. Do you think, from the Aboriginal side of things, there could be, there could be some of those elements, especially for people of the interior, seeing a seal in that environment? How would they have known what they were looking at? How would they have described it other than through available animals that they could picture, and then from their mental library, a rabbit's head, these flippant like feet, seal-like body.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. I'm not as familiar with the sort of Aboriginal depictions from because we've got Aboriginal art here. And, I'm not as familiar with the depictions from that, or I haven't specifically talked to Aboriginal tribal elders and stuff about this topic. But I'm actually very more interested to understand their depictions of the bunyip as well. And this lady who I told you about, she's really, to her, this is her religion, right? This is her belief. It's very spiritual, in touch with the land, which is what a lot of Aboriginals are. They're very respectful to the land and pay tributes to the spirits, and to the elders past and present. And so it'll be very interesting to see that, because it's hard to gauge on a depiction of bunyip. Unlike other cryptids, we obviously know what a thylacine looks like and what a yowie looks like and all that. But the bunyip, what is a bunyip? That's the question that ponders. Like when it comes to Hexham, as I told you before, I think Hexham is actually connected to the sea, but Hexham Channel goes pretty far out from the sea. So if there are seals or sea lions going into there, it's pretty interesting. Nonetheless,
No, it is. I mean, it really, really is interesting. And I think, these are the sort of the common monster imposters that we always look for. Doesn't necessarily mean that's what it is. It's just, I suppose it's, tick that off the list, right? For those things. But there's other water monsters in Australia as well. And maybe you can tell me about the ones that I don't know. Obviously, the famous one is the Hawkesbury River Monster. And I remember when we chatted before, you had some interesting ideas about what that could have been.
I reckon that is because based on the descriptions alone, and the thing with the Hawkesbury River is it goes no deep than about 38 meters. If you look at the Hawkesbury River Monster, I should clarify, is described like a plesiosaur, the same as the Loch Ness Monster and other sea monsters around the world. I've been to Hawkesbury River. I had to travel down there just to go to Sydney. I've been to Sydney hundreds of times. I used to play sports down there and all sorts. But when it comes to the Hawkesbury River Monster, it doesn't compare to other sea monsters around the world, because I've actually done some digging as well. There was this lake in Sweden that has a sea serpent type creature description, and with that lake, I think it goes hundreds of meters deep.
Oh, it's very deep. Lake Storzian.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, very deep.
And the same with the Loch Ness Monster is very deep as well. Hawkesbury River is not a deep river. I guarantee you, if there is a plesiosaur there, would have been discovered by now. It's not deep at all. It goes no deeper than 38 meters. And also, the interesting part is there's a place there. I think it's called Devil's Cove. I could be wrong, and I don't know why it's called Devil's Cove. Interesting name, but there's a large number of leopard seal sightings and sea lion sightings in that specific cove. And in fact, that's where the majority of sightings take place. So to me, that is enough to instigate possibly, well, most likely, case closed to the Hawkesbury River Monster, in my honest opinion. Nonetheless, there hasn't been any documented sightings since the 80s, actually, which is pretty interesting. Rex Gilroy, who I'm a good friends with, and he actually wrote a book on the Hawkesbury River Monster, and there have been other researchers who have went and done investigations. I myself have been down there, and I've actually used a camera, like an underwater camera in that area, and I picked up nothing. The water's fairly murky there.
Okay.
When I used it was when I used the camera, I've used it to the same area where the sightings have taken place, actually, off a jetty. And basically, the water was so murky you couldn't see anything in there. It was not very clear water.
Okay.
But yeah, so it's, for me, I believe that the Hawkesbury River Monster is possibly a mistaken identity.
And a leopard seal, I mean, that's we wouldn't see those in this part of the world, but that's a huge animal.
Yes.
That's a really, really huge animal, and I think, and it looks fierce. It's got big teeth. The neck does look slightly elongate as well.
Yeah.
And I think if you saw one of those, popping up on your walk, and then obviously they're not inhabitants there. They must stray by from time to time, right? If you saw one of those on your walk, and suddenly this this 12-foot creature, so lips out of the water, and you see those little serpentine humps, or that little spy hopping thing going on, you could more than believe that you were seeing something monstrous.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
And because, if you look at a leopard seal, they look a lot like a plesiosaur. They really do. It can be easily mistaken identity when it comes to a leopard seal, and to other species there, and particularly the people who don't often see those species, which is something I also like to talk about as well, because mistaken identity is a very important thing to talk about in cryptozoology as well. For people who aren't as familiar with certain species, when I was younger, I'd hear sounds, that would intrigue me, and I wouldn't know what they were.
Yeah.
And, oh, that's a possum. Oh, that's cool. And I don't know if you've ever heard what a possum sounds like, but they sound quite fierce. For small animals, they have quite a monstrous sound. So very.
And this brings me to another thing, really, and I think this is good. I'm seeing more and more of this in cryptozoology these days. Like people who want to find mysterious creatures, objectively looking at the evidence, like the Hawkesbury River Monster, and saying, oh, actually, it probably is something explainable, when it is, at least. I think that's important. That helps the genre, because then other outside persons will say, well, look, they're willing to debunk when it's time to debunk, and they're willing to look further when it's time to look further. They seem balanced. Maybe there's something in this, instead of this kind of belief situation we've been in for a long time, where people sort of believe in Bigfoot or believe in Nessie, and which sort of denotes faith to me in a sense. It seems to be a strange aspect of a genre that's seeking hidden animals to believe in them. It's kind of a weird thing. And now I know there are crossovers in that, because of course with some First Nations persons, and even with old Celtic folklore and Aboriginal folklore, there's that crossover of the spiritual and the real, and the corporeal, where certain creatures in their legends occupy both. right? So it's difficult to extract what's absolutely real from what's religious or folkloric. Is that right? But from that aspect, I thought maybe we'd go into the different hairy humanoids in Australia, like the Yowie and the larger ones like the Quinkin and Doolittle and the Junjadees, the little fellas.
Yeah.
What do you know about those guys?
Well, obviously the Yowie is Australia's Bigfoot and occupies the Great Dividing Range. When it comes down to a lot of them, the Quink simply another name as well. The Doolittle, their other name is Putican, which is from this area. The Putican, the Wabakal tribe. So that's the area because I'm from Lake Macquarie as well. And there's the Putican story takes place at a place called Mount Sugarloaf, and literally I look at Mount Sugarloaf every morning when I get up because I'm so close.
Wow.
There hasn't been a sighting there since the 60s I've been able to find, but right next to us, Waddingers National Park, where I've conducted a lot of research, and there has been plenty of sightings there. The Junjadee is described as a smaller version of a Yowie in size, the same as Indonesia has the orang pendek and the orang gadang. The gadang is a rather large species by description, and the orang pendek is described to be smaller. So it's kind of a similar situation there. Some people believe that the Junjadee is simply a juvenile Yowie that's smaller that people have mistaken for a separate species. So there are different beliefs as well, whether we have more than one separate species of a Sasquatch or Bigfoot, or we don't have a separate, whether we do or we don't. Through my research in Yowie, there's a lot of credible sightings. I found a lot of credible sightings. I couldn't believe it. You do get the ones who simply, there's a lot of people who have made up story, or kind of they made up stories, so I don't know for a fact, but they would say another thing, and their story changes, right?
Yeah.
That's why, for me, when I go out there, I always took a notepad and pen and write everything down, so I couldn't, because it's perfectly normal that people can, over time, the story changes, especially if they were to encounter something like a Yowie, where it just stuns them. Like, just to see a Yowie would be so beyond possibility for them. And then it's like, wow, I've seen something that's from folklore. This is amazing. And so documentation straight away is important. It is crucial if someone has a sighting to document it as soon as possible. Not a lot of people go out there expecting to see one and have notepad and pen. Most sightings are from people who are going out looking anyway. But, there are a lot of researchers who have, and particularly going back, I've read articles back in the 1800s in Australia, where naturalism, because of Australia being such a naturally curious world, and coming from England, where there's been some fantastic naturalists, such as Charles Darwin, Australia had all these naturalists back in the 1800s, and the ones that would have encounters with the Yowies would document sightings, but have notepad and pen. Every single time they went in that environment, they always took a notepad and a pen with them, and they documented in a journal what they had saw. And so that was really interesting when they have proper documentation of what they've actually encountered, which is where for me, I always make sure that is of the utmost importance when it comes to equipment. You can go out there and you can use all the fancy gadgets. A lot of them try to do, like FLIR cameras and normal things like you can use, you can have plaster casts and stuff like that. That's good. But the most important thing you can have is actually cheaper than all of that. It's a notepad and pen. Because
isn't that what the police say? That their most valuable piece of equipment is a notepad and pen? They do.
Probably, because it documents everything. Because even for someone like me, if I was to go out there without notepad and pen and actually see, let's say I see a Yowie and I haven't documented it, then down the track I'm overthinking the whole situation, and I've come up with new solutions to that situation.
Yeah.
And that's normal. Everyone can do that.
Yeah.
Oh,
We remember things differently over time. That's a fact.
exactly. And that's why it's important to always take a notepad and pen so we can document the facts while they're there. In fact, I believed I had an encounter when I was 15, hang on, 16. Yeah, 16 at the time. Um, so it would have been 2015. I was just before my 16th birthday. So I was only even younger, but uh, I believed I had an encounter. And what did I do? I took a notepad and pen, and I've got the notepad and pen. Well, sorry, not the pen, but the notepad. And at my dad's house, to be honest with you. But I still have it with me because I've documented that day. It was January 17, 2015, at about 5:15 in the afternoon. It was daylight savings, so still the sun was out for the next couple of hours, probably less than. Um, and I looked through thick scrub. I saw this rather large, interesting uh, creature looking back at me, rather brownish to orangish hair, and had its hand on the tree looking at me. Now, this was through thick scrub when it was almost completely quiet other than the wind. And I was with my father at the time. And I was like, "Did you see that?" He couldn't see anything. He didn't have his glasses on him and anything. And then before I knew, this creature had gone. I saw this creature looking back at me. And people often ask me, was I intimidated? Was I scared? I always say no, because this creature had no intention to harm me. And how do I know that? Because it didn't make a move towards me or anything. It just left. It was about 20 to 50 meters from me, and through thick scrub at trees, through a clearing, I saw this creature. Obviously saw me, knew I was there. I knew that this creature was there because I happened to look at that place where they were standing. I didn't hear a sound or anything. All I heard was a tree. It was actually a tree branch fell off one of the top trees. Um, and then that lured me to that area. And so the Yowie, or whatever this was, I shouldn't say it was a Yowie because I have no evidence. But basically made no sound to lure me to my observation to actually have encountered.
Mhm.
But I found that was an incredibly interesting experience. And
Absolutely.
a lot of people, most of the sightings I've had given to me before by eyewitnesses, nearly all of them would end in fear some way.
Mm.
They'll say, "Oh, I was afraid for my life," or yeah, they may have very well been because we're talking about a potential animal that we haven't proven exists and are out of the realm of normality until they encounter. And so, for me to have an encounter where I'm able to tell people I was not in fear is a rarity in itself.
I think that's an amazing encounter. I wonder in that situation, was it perhaps the distance that you were from the creature, that the creature appeared hidden, that stopped you feeling afraid, or that even if I'm looking at you right now, if I'm looking at you from 50 feet away, from your body language, from your face, even if you're an animal, I can tell whether there's a threat or not because we have that instinctive knowledge within
Yeah,
us. Was it more that you could tell there was no threat? You were simply observed or noticed by the creature who noticed you notice it, and then when you turned to your father, that was its chance to get away, and it left.
I think it was a bit of both because the distance, because so obviously being through thick scrub, there's still so many trees and scrub in the way between me and
Mm.
this creature I've observed before this creature could actually get to me,
Yeah.
whether it wanted to harm me or not. However, um, all I saw was a curious creature, and I believe, based on my own observation, that this was a curious creature just looking at me, knew I was there, probably before we know, may have actually encountered other people before. This creature was going about its time, and I also had done nothing to instigate harming it or to have,
you
stop.
weren't presenting any sort of a threat either, really, I suppose. And I often wonder, obviously not every time, because things do go wrong with wild animals in pretty harmless encounters. But I am guessing the creature perceived not only that you were young and with a parent figure, so that's a protection as well in the animal world, I think, that you were accompanied by a parental figure. I do believe that's something, and that you were no threat, perhaps, and that was it. What about the face? Now, people must ask you this all the time. I'm guessing this is always the next question, right? What of the face did you see? What could you describe in that small sort of window of sight that you had? Because you saw the arm against the tree, you saw the hair or fur. Could you see the face? You saw the eyes for sure.
Well, obviously being further away, this is where it gets a little bit tricky in descriptions. But what I believe I saw was a rather broad human face, similar to that of an orangutan, but probably not the same. I'd probably say closer to a human, but it was still a broad face.
So like a flat muzzle, almost, or
yeah, pretty much. And as far as other descriptions go, a rather bulky body, broad shoulders.
wow.
Uninteresting. In fact, I may still have somewhere. I wrote down. I actually drew my encounter.
Wow.
I actually, and I'm not a very good artist, but this was actually really good for my work as well. I'd actually observed. I've actually written down my observations as well to drew it down to match with what I had already written down, and in itself was a very fascinating encounter. Rather brownish, orangish hair, bulky, muscular, rather big legs. I mean, obviously, this was
That's a really good sighting. I mean, you had a sighting. It's clear, really. I mean, whether you want to call it a Yowie or not to be, technically objective,
yeah.
I understand that, but that seems like a pretty strong sighting to me, Jack.
I mean, it is, and it's really hard to talk about it as well because you always don't want to come on. And for me personally, also go, obviously I do a lot of work with wildlife conservation and do a lot of science work outside of cryptozoology. For me, it's hard to say I saw a Yowie because who's going to take me seriously if I saw a Yowie and I can't be like, here's the evidence I saw a Yowie, because I have no evidence. And to me, that's where it becomes very subjective. People either believe me, people don't. People may think I just saw a tree or something.
Yeah.
But I believe in what I saw. Nonetheless, I have no evidence, which is where it gets very tricky. It's the unfortunate thing about looking for, if you want to keep scientific to the topic, it's really hard to do that if you have an encounter. Very hard to do that because it seems like anyone who ever, even scientifically speaking, anyone who has an encounter is automatically dismissed. So it's really a tricky field. So that's where as well, I'm very careful with how I try to be careful with how I word things with the topic of the Yowie, whether I had an encounter or not.
No, absolutely. Yeah, because no, you don't get any in your field of work, especially in the regular life sciences. You don't get a special medal for claiming to have seen a Yowie. You get demoted almost, right? In people's opinions, people's estimation of you. My personal opinion would that be as in regards presentation of your experiences. I had an experience that I can't explain. That's it, And then when everybody thinks you're not trying to explain it or ascribe it, they're kind of willing to listen a bit. Oh, that's odd. That's really strange, Jack. Yeah, okay. Oh, really? Do you think it was I don't know what it was. But I do run the Australian Cryptozoology Conference. You know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And with the conference as well, there are people who believe, obviously there are different people in the field. You have the more scientific people, you have the different people, and there's often people who say, I should be getting this research because they strongly agree with their ideas. But that's not the point of the conference.
No.
The point of the conference has always been not just scientifically based, but to challenge your own ideas. Because if we're not talking about species we know for a fact, we can't say that yowies exist in the Australian bush. We can't create a conservation area because of yowies, because that's it. As much as I believe in yowies, that's still ridiculous because we haven't proven it. We need to prove them
Yes.
before look at doing that. There have been people who have actually suggested to me that we should do that, but actually we shouldn't because we haven't proven that yowies exist. So when it comes down to the conference, I want people's ideas to be challenged, including the speakers, because how are we able to broaden our own horizons as researchers when we go out there and then think about what we've now learnt from another researcher and from their experiences and from their research and their research methods? How are we supposed to grow and get better as researchers if we can't even do that? And I love cryptozoology because of from environmental perspectives as well, because it's teaching more people to be environmental and be environmentalists. Because there's so many people I've seen over the years who just started and who grew a knowledge of wildlife and nature because they're going out there looking for these animals, and then they grew a passion for and love for animals as well. So for me personally, it's of the utmost importance before you go into any research area to actually research and understand the animals in the area. If you, for example, as someone like you who's from England comes to Australia unaware of of sounds that koalas and possums make, you go into an area where there's yowie sightings, you want to investigate it, you hear koalas or possums, and then you think it's a yowie because you haven't heard sounds before. That's happened to me when I was first in Queensland. I've never heard of a brown cuckoo dove before.
Yeah.
And they make a really weird whooping sound, which sometimes people describe yowies to do. And I send that into Gary Oppen, and Gary's like, that's a brown cuckoo dove. So,
He's great with that identification of animal
he's
sounds. He's awesome.
he's absolutely, and so that helped me a lot. And so that just proves, and Gary proves why people should be investigating that area before that.
Absolutely. I mean, you can't go in with confirmation bias. I even had, and I struggle with this a lot in sort of that Bigfoot genre, especially here in the UK, where, there are sightings, there are stories and histories, but it's a very hard sell because essentially it's a much smaller area, and some people could really argue that the popularity of it has arisen with the popularity of the subject in the last sort of 10-15 years. And I've got people posting videos like, oh, that was like a British Bigfoot making a sound here, and I'm like, that's an owl. And then the person's replied, yes, but they mimic owls sometimes.
Yeah, but that's
But how do you know that's one mimicking an owl? And not just an owl, which exists in the British countryside. And it goes on, because if we go with this hopeful, I mean, in science, confirmation bias is a very well-known thing, and not to say that scientists don't employ confirmation bias, it happens all the time, but we can't do it because we're already fringe and we're already credulous, so we've got to be hardest on ourselves, because we're going to send it to those guys if we do get some evidence, and they're going to rip it to shreds. We've got to be, we've got to have done all of that searching and all of that, what's the word, sifting through the weaknesses of our evidence before we present it to anybody, because that's just the scene with cryptid animals, and it's not the same with things like Yowie and orang pendek and Nessie as it is with, I found a new species of newt in Sumatra. People are up for that. That's okay. Or I found I think they found a new species of whale in Baja, California, in the Gulf of California recently. They found a pod of them. And these are whales. They're huge.
Yeah, exactly.
They've always been there. And I guess people saw them and just never, with water sightings, it's difficult. Nobody ever said, "Oh, what kind of whale is that?"
Exactly.
Right? So we've got that option. There's definitely space for it, but how do we go forward? And somebody like yourself, being in the sciences, I think it's an important aspect of this.
The very good points. And in terms of the British Bigfoot, that's actually a very interesting one when it comes to science, because the UK, and I've actually never been, I've first state that I've never been in the UK. I was supposed to go to university in England.
Oh wow.
But I think the university I was going to study and do wildlife conservation in was involved with a project to rehabilitate European brown bears and grey wolves to southwest Europe. And they're rather large animals. They're large predatory animals. I think at the moment, UK's largest existing animal is the predatory animal is the fox, I think, or badger.
Fox or badger, probably I think the badger is probably bigger overall, but the fox is a taller animal. Yeah, it would be the fox. It's probably the fox.
And so they're talking about bringing them back in. Obviously, the biodiversity over years, because in itself has had a lot of deforestation and a lot of ancient forests. The countryside of the UK is not much forest anymore. It's literally open grassland. So when it comes down to that, I can understand. I can completely understand the skepticism about a UK Bigfoot. Nonetheless, there are still sightings. So I think that it's kind of naive to suggest that Bigfoot can't exist in the UK. Personally, do I believe that the Bigfoot exists in the UK? I'm yet to see that, only because of the deforestation rate. Obviously, same thing that I'll apply it to here in Australia as well. Are you familiar with a place called Kilcoy or Mount Kilcoy?
I've heard of it. Yeah.
Kilcoy is considered the Yowie capital of Australia. That's where the Yowie statue. I've been there before. There were still sightings up to that point, particularly Mount Kilcoy.
Oh, I know the big wooden statue.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
A couple of times. Mount Kilcoy, it takes about 2 minutes drive to get to the top. There's no signs of wildlife unless birds. There's a lack of bush. Well, there was a bit of bush, but there's a lack of it. I couldn't find any signs of water sources around there or anything. So for me as well, from a wildlife perspective, I always look at the environmental evidence. So when it comes down to UK that, but also I can't say unless I'm in the UK. I can't actually say until I go to the UK. Or there's a possibility, because quite frankly, we're talking about rather large species as well. Descriptions based on large 6 foot, 7 foot tall.
Yeah, I mean, it really is. And sorry to interject. I just I've been studying it for a few years, and I definitely know a lot of witnesses. Let's say there's probably 10 witnesses that I know personally that I wholeheartedly believe that they saw what they saw, or that they believe they saw what they saw. That much. But the cell is very difficult. The landscape, actually, there was this big assessment, a government-based assessment of the land, and it was something like 6.8% of the entire landmass is urban sprawl, including motorways and rural settlements of the entire country. So that was important. That was quite reassuring. I was like, wow, you really get this sort of concrete jungle feeling from the estimates, but actually it's really underpopulated. And in Scotland, it was something crazy, like only 1.9% of their land mass was urban, including, again, rural settlements and roads. And I thought, well, that's something extraordinary. I tried to argue in my head that if there was such a thing here, it would always have been adapted to our environment, not like the stipulations of North America, for example.
Yeah.
But, as I go along, it's not my place to believe or not believe. I believe a whole bunch of the witnesses. I believe there's space, there's food sources, there's spaces to hide mines and caves and all kinds of things. But I'm not entirely sure if it's not some sort of, what's the word? That pinhole camera effect that you get where basically, you get that pinhole camera you're making in college or school, and you put the magnetic paper and you capture a photo. That was the
Yep.
original way that they did it. And some people have argued for things like ghosts, that the building becomes this pinhole camera that replays the conditions and replays that, ghostly walking figure. And I wonder if the memory or the folkloric, I don't know, nostalgia of such creatures as the woodwows and the wild man, like we're having with fairies here at the moment, which has exploded in popularity again, especially in places like Ireland, if this is not replaying because of pop culture in our minds. And if the pop culture wasn't there, would it be happening? That's what I'm questioning right now.
That's a very, 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 very good point. Because it's quite possible, especially with the expansion of a lot of TV shows. I don't know if you guys get as much as what we do with the cryptid shows. I
We
think you
do.
guys,
Yeah.
So that's all it will take. That's all it will take. My aunt and uncle, if they've been hugely big fans. Before I got involved, they were big fans of Finding Bigfoot.
Yeah.
It's not hard to come across people who know about that show and know about that. So when you talk about sort of the nostalgia of these subjects, I believe all it will take is someone to watch that and find it. Oh wow, that's remarkable! I had no clue about that. And then all of a sudden, in their mind, wow, this is, they've got to be real now, and because people want to be real, want to be real. And that's much the case here. That's much the case.
Over the Yowie?
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
I think, but the Yowie, yet again, the Yowie community and the story has been going on for hundreds of years. We're talking as soon as pretty much settlement, there's been stories. So the Yowie in itself is the Yowie tales can be quite different than that
Yeah.
of the Sasquatch. And actually, interesting enough, just going to get on to another topic because this is actually an interesting one. If you familiar with the story with the belief that the Yowie is more aggressive than other.
Yes. Yeah, I've heard that.
Yeah. So that's actually interesting because there's a place called Pilliga Scrub, which you may be familiar with.
I know what that is. Yeah.
So that's 5.5 hours north of here, and people who aren't involved with Yowie research tell me not to go there. And the Pilliga Scrub, people know not to go there. I mean, from what I've heard, I know people who've camped there, and apparently it's a generally petrifying, according to these people. And I'm not even exaggerating. It might be exaggerated from them, but I'm not, from what I've heard, it might be very, they seem to be quite terrified of it, just from going along the highway there and whatnot. But it all stemmed from an 80s radio story on ABC radio and here in Australia. And then that Slim Dusty, who's one of Australia's most legendary country singers and wrote bush ballads, he wrote a song called "There's Something in the Pilliga," which later on there was a movie called "There's Something in the Pilliga." The Pilliga Scrub created this legend. So basically, the stories there seem to be quite aggressive. And we're not just talking about the truck driver who in the 80s claimed that he was dragged from his truck one night, by a Yowie where he saw human legs up on a tree and he was crying on radio, which is a very interesting. I don't know how real it is. That story, it seems so. I don't even know what to think of that.
He saw human legs up in the tree, like decapitated human legs stuck up in a tree, or a human-like legs dangling down from a tree.
I don't remember if he clarified that. I haven't heard that.
Yeah.
That story in some time, but you can actually probably see it. I think the thing is still on YouTube. You'll be able to.
For that. Yeah, have a look for that.
It gives you goosebumps when you listen to it, but I don't know how real or accurate it is. But this whole area seems to be quite aggressive. And the thing is, what interests me is that the Pilliga Scrub is actually known for some clashes between coal miners and locals. So because there's mining going on there, and there's such a deforestation going on there, and environmental disaster going on there. I've said to people that there could be a possibility of aggression towards humans there if they view as their home being taken from them by people. At the same time, as I said, this is just hypothetically say that Yowies exist. If Yowies exist, what's their behaviour? They might turn on people if they see people destroying their homes, and maybe that's why the pilliga scrub get more aggressive sightings.
That's interesting.
Is because of the environmental disaster going on there.
Did you, Jack? Did you hear about those killer whales attacking boats in the Straits of Gibraltar last year? So apparently there's a pod of Mediterranean killer whales that hang around the Straits of Gibraltar, and there's been quite a lot of overfishing, they think, in this area, and perhaps it's theorized that perhaps one or two of the members of the pod may have been caught in some of the nets. And what they do now, at that bit I don't know for sure, but what they do now very regularly when sort of medium-sized vessels, cruising pleasure vessels, are passing by, they attack the vessel and disable the rudder. You know that?
Wow.
And they've done it to about 7 or 8 different ships the last year and a half. Then they start smashing the boat at the sides. There's footage of them doing it online. It's very unusual behavior for killer whales. But the theory is something about their environment has been destroyed or invaded, and they have identified the humans are doing it, and they're taking revenge on them.
Yes, it's very interesting. It's probably it sounds like a very similar situation.
Yeah.
Behavioral instincts. It's a survival instinct, actually. It's a survival trait. And when it comes down to the Yowie, and I've always, because I study evolution as well, and I find that hugely fascinating. And ethology is behavior. We're talking about, people. I think that people skip that topic a lot. They always assume the behavior. They're not observing, and that can become a real problem. And so when it comes down to the behavior of a Yowie, I mean, what is their behavior? Based on the descriptions alone, I'm not looking at, I felt like I was going to be killed, because you don't know that. I'm not looking at that kind of instincts. But the bluff charges,
Yeah.
I mean, gorillas do bluff charges, and only 1% of those bluff charges end in harm, serious injury, or death. So that's a territorial thing. So I believe that based on these, now I'm going to put into a little picture here. If we're talking Yowies exist, based on sightings alone, their behavior would be territorial, survival, and even compassion. Because in some instincts, there are actually sightings where they're more curious and compassionate, and there's ones where they're more territorial, and there's ones where they're more survival. So when it comes down to, let's say, pilliga scrub, if they're attacking people because they feel like their home's been invaded and their environment's been destroyed, that's survival and also territorial. Bluff charges, territorial, where that's probably their feeding ground. They don't like people being there. And also compassion or curiosity, because they're generally curious about us. If we're curious about them, they can become curious about us. Other animals also can become quite curious as well. Well, I used to work with Tasmanian devils down in Tasmania, and back in 2017. And when I did that, they were very curious animals. What they would do is, because they didn't have the best eyesight, they would come up and they would sniff you. That's what they would do. These were rather wild. These were rather wild Tasmanian devils that are due for release, and basically, these were wild Tasmanian devils that were curious. They weren't like your typical zoo animals. So in itself, Tasmanian devils also being curious. I worked with koalas. They did the exact same thing as Tasmanian devils. On sometimes they would actually climb you out of curiosity, and so they're also another curious animal. So I think that the Yowie itself, based on descriptions from what I saw myself, they are probably very curious. So I believe that's the three. That is the three main traits that we've seen in sightings.
Mm-hmm.
Territorial, survival, curiosity, and the curiosity one is actually harder to come by, but territorial, survival are more common. Particularly territorial, the bluff charges seem to be a very common thing in Australia and in America. But yeah, when it comes down to behaviour, I think that those are the aspects we kind of look at.
It's interesting. Yeah, and it's largely encouraging as well if you think of it, that we know the bluff charges exist because people largely survive them. So, and the ones they don't survive, we don't know about those people anyway, So that's the downside. And I don't really know what that percentage would be. But it shows intelligence, And I think the mistake we make sometimes with animals, people that is, one is thinking that they're without personality. All animals, individual animals, have individual personalities. I've seen it. You see it in your cats and dogs. If you've owned 3 or 4 dogs or 3 or 4 cats, you'll see they've all had different personalities. Yes, there's predictable parameters which animals behave within each species of animal, but there's a myriad of different possibilities within that. And sorry, one of the things I think sometimes about like Bigfoot encounters is that individual animal that bumps into you, similarly to yourself, has to evaluate that situation and decide what to do about it, just like a bear or something. You bump into a bear in the wood, and the bear says, is this creature a threat to me? Is this creature food? Can I just get around? Is this creature making intimidating eye contact? What am I going to do about this? How will I get out of here? Or is this lunch? Or whatever the creature's going to do. And I think it's the same around, like with chimps. One chimp will spend all day hugging and grooming you. The other will beat you to death with your own arms. That's animals. Similarly to people, some are very easygoing and some not so much.
There's literally no difference between us and animals that I tell people, because we may look different, our biology may be slightly different, but we all are the same. We have the same kind of traits, behavioral traits. We act the same, other than creating technology in houses, which people seem to think makes us well above other people. Well above other species, well above animals. That's not true. That doesn't mean we're more superior than other animals. We're the same. They all, as you said, personalities. We have ourselves. All have personalities. We're all different, and that goes for animals. If I had 5 dogs, and they all look the same, I bet I could tell them apart based on how they act.
Yes, absolutely.
That's because they're all much different. And another good example as well, how's a dog going to act if they were treated so poorly and beaten when they were a pup and then rescued? They're going to be more aggressive and more standoffish. And the pup that was
no, I agree. Yeah, I mean, of course, there's the aspect of the Yowie could be a predator of some kind, or it might just be an omnivore that responds to its dietary needs in certain situations, and perhaps similarly to bears, very occasionally somebody could be a big protein source and on the menu in that situation, in that very circumstance. I don't personally believe they or most animals are predators of humans. Very few animals are predators of humans, though many have the possibility to be.
Yes. Well, I think it's pretty interesting when we talk about whether they are predatory or not. And in terms of the Yowie, I believe that they are, simply based on locations alone where I've been. I've been to areas where there wasn't much, even weeks of vegetation to eat, but there happens to be a large number of sightings, and yet there also happens to be a large number of species in the area. We're talking. So I actually run my own side conservation project called the Waddingtons Project that based the Waddingtons National Park Natural Wildlife in the Heaton State Forest and Olney State Forest. Through that, I've documented several species. We're talking macropods like the swamp wallaby, brush-tailed rock wallaby, and eastern grey kangaroos. They're all heavily, as everywhere in Australia, mostly eastern grey kangaroos, I should say, in this coast. They're also being sighted up in the Waddingtons National Park, where there's a large number of sightings. So is the lace monitor lizard, or the goanna, the common hairy-nosed wombat, the koala, and all that there, ringtail possums, brush-tailed possums, you name it. There's so many species there. Echidna as well. I've seen echidnas up there. I've documented several species, and I do wildlife as well. There's in this area alone, there's the white ibis and the straw-necked ibis as well.
Oh, I really like those, you know.
Yeah, so
the
other
like
the straw-necked ibis from my backyard, only about a 2-minute drive from here. So, there are several species in this area, and species are actually growing in this area, and I only live on the foothills of the mountains. But basically, there's, as far as food source goes, if they're a predatory animal, a carnivorous animal, they have an all-you-can-eat buffet in the Waddingtons National Park. And the Waddingtons National Park, from my own personal experience, from the sightings I've received, from even looking online, it seems to have equal most, or if not the most, amount of sightings in Australia. I'm not including Blue Mountains, because the Blue Mountains got so many national parks and forests towards it, so Blue Mountains would easily win. But there's such a large national park in such a large area that anything could live it there and survive based on the food source, and we wouldn't.
I look forward to checking it out. I've been I did notice your project online as well. I think it's really great work that you're doing with the conservation as well as everything else. I did write an article recently that was published, and it was the basic concept of it is, will some of the world's undiscovered species become extinct before we have a chance to protect them? And I think in some areas at least, that's a possibility. Countries like your own, which are doing much better, and mine, and some others are well on their way, but there's so many places around the world, and many in Asia as well, especially where these things will just become extinct and nobody will care, and that'll be that. And but it's interesting, I think, to at least try to document these things and do work to conserve them at the same time in the meantime. And I live in the hope that the age of adventure, it never ended. We just lost interest, and people are finding interest again. And if we can sell that joy of exploration and discovery again, even if it's rediscovering things we haven't really paid attention to for some time, people will get on board and they'll look after them. It'll become profitable to people to keep them there to see, and for future generations, and that's a way forward. Just before we go, Jack, I wondered if you could talk about the mystery marsupials of Australia, like the Thylacine and the marsupial line. Is there a possibility of a mainland Thylacine?
Yes, there is. But I've been to Tasmania, and I've been to areas where there's been also a hotbed of sightings for thylacine, including Barrington Tops, and also coast of New South Wales. The thylacine on mainland, it's where it gets a little bit tricky, because I guarantee you that on the mainland, if there was a thylacine, become easier to actually find one and bring in a body, but that has yet to happen. So story goes in 1930s sometime, I'd like to say around 35, 36, when Benjamin died, the last living Tasmanian tiger. There was a group of conservationists, apparently. There was a journal that reported a group of conservationists had actually, back in the early 1930s, had gotten several male and female Tasmanian tigers. They went on a boat with them through the Bass Straits. The Bass Straits between Tasmania and Melbourne, like Victoria as well. They went there and they had released them into Gippsland in Victoria. And so that's where the story goes, the mainland Tasmania.
Okay. This makes more sense now.
Yeah. So when I was in Tasmania, at first I thought, oh, maybe the Tasmanian tiger survived on the mainland and not Tasmania. But in Tasmania, it's become quite possible that the Tasmanian tiger, the Thylacine, could be thriving in Tasmania. It's so dense there.
Wow.
I think I've been along the east coast from up the Sunshine Coast in Queensland all the way down to Tasmania. And I've done expeditions in Jimna, Queensland for Yowies and Blue Mountains, Tasmania, and it became quite possible. The idea of the Tasmanian tiger, the idea of the Thylacine became more possible in Tasmania than anywhere else. There are sightings in Adelaide and sightings in all different parts of the country. But I think the possibility exists primarily with Tasmania, mostly. But mainland Thylacine is a possibility in itself. But if you look at the sightings, I think that there's more than double the amount of sightings that take place in Tasmania.
So that's an interesting thing. Really, we've got to go back to the source of where they were and stop looking for these mystery sightings further afield. Is it inaccessible, most of Tasmania then? I mean, to vehicles and whatnot? Is it just so heavily forested that any internal expedition you're going to do is going to be on foot with,
It is. It is very inaccessible, a lot of the places there. If you want to do a serious expedition of a Thylacine, Thylacine's there, you really kind of have to spend 4 days on trek.
Yeah.
In very dense forests. It's probably through thick snow. I mean, Tasmanian's weather is very. I was there during their winter, and Tasmania snows a lot, and there has been known to snow during summer, I believe.
Is it that Antarctic stream that comes up there?
Yeah.
What is that called? I forget now. Yeah, I'll find it.
And so Tasmania itself has such weird climate. It can be, in a way, aggressive climate, and also very thick terrain. So it isn't an easy area to be doing investigations in and do expeditions in. But to do it properly, you need to spend 4 days there, trekking through Tasmania, and using trail cameras if you can, and other sources as well, documentation around the area of where you're doing that from. So
Excuse me.
Should be on the bucket list for any.
Oh yeah. I mean, for me, it's as now when I come to visit you guys, I intend to stay at least a sort of a week to 2 weeks, and going to have to check out a few things, because if you come halfway around the world to a land full of cryptid tales, you can't just talk at a conference for a few days and bugger off home. You're gonna have to have a bit of a snoop about. So I'll have to pick your brains for some advice on that. Jack, thank you so much for coming on today. We really appreciate it. Regarding the Australian Cryptozoology Conference and you and the work that you do, where can people find you? Where can they get involved and get tickets if they're going to come along, if they're local or flying in? Tell us all about it.
So the Australian Cryptozoology Conference, you can find us on Facebook. Just typing Australian Cryptozoology Conference. The same for Twitter and also on Instagram as well. Mostly active on Facebook. Tickets are going to become available from the first Monday of October. So I think that's the 3rd of October. So we're going to have tickets available then. Of course, you've got yourself, we've got Rex Gilroy, Murray Byfield, Gary Alpert will all be talking. We're going to announce some more as well. Actually, we're going to be announcing some more today. So
awesome.
Yeah, another one today. So there is a lot on offer. We've got a weekend pass. We've got on 2 days, and we've got a weekend pass, and we've got a 1 day pass as well. So if you want to stop by for 1 day, we've got a 1 day pass available. If you want to stop, we're going to do the whole weekend. We've got a weekend pass available. Basically, it's going to be a great opportunity to actually meet the speakers, talk to them, pick their brains about a lot of these topics, engage with members of the community, and also grab some books and other merchandise as well. And we're going to have raffles. We're going to have an eyewitness tell-all. So
Wow.
if you want to come along, basically it's a perfect opportunity to share your encounter publicly with the room, with a bunch of people who are very open-minded to these ideas. So come along and enjoy the day, and so enjoy the weekend, and meet these speakers, grab some books. You'll be able to grab some more knowledge from them when they talk. We're going to have some very interesting topics up there at the conference. So yeah, just come by and have fun and enjoy this great weekend, April 22 and 23 next year at the Central Leagues Club in Charlestown, New South Wales.
Wow. Well, look, I'm really, really looking forward to it, and obviously, Jack definitely expects you to come by if you're in New South Wales anywhere. You've got no excuse not to attend, and anybody else who wants to fly in will be more than welcome. Jack, Tessier, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your knowledge, and for all the great work you do in conservation. It's been great to talk to you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, my friend. Bye-bye.
Bye.